The city in India has been described as a place of dizzying contrasts. It's a microcosm of a vastly diverse country, diverse in language, religion, culture, and the social and economic status of its people. A reflection of this diversity is the newspaper. It's everywhere in the city, in homes, offices, railway stations, streets. There are some 6,000 registered newspapers in India. 650 of them are dailies, with 200 million readers. India's newspapers are published in the country's many languages: Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati, Tamil, Assamese, Bengali, Punjabi, Telugu, Oriya, Kannada, Malayalam, Konkani, Urdu, Kashmiri, and more. And then there's the English language daily newspaper, a legacy of the British who colonized India until the middle of the 20th century. When the colonizers left, their language remained, as did much of their architecture, culture, and political framework. So what has the English language newspaper meant for India? It's often said that the media are a mirror to society, a mirror that often reflects a distorted version of reality. So here we try to capture facets of modern India as reflected by this media mirror, and in doing so, examine a media system divided by language. In 1947, under the spiritual nonviolent leadership of Mahatma Gandhi, India finally achieved independence from Britain. Its first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, implemented socialistic economic policies that emphasized self-reliance. Western consumer goods were not allowed, and Western businesses were barred from entering India. This was known as the import substitution era, and with a few changes, it lasted many decades. But in the 1990s, India liberalized its economy, allowing multinational businesses more freedom to operate within its borders. Now tied to the global economy, India found its niche in the information technology industries, or IT. New employment opportunities developed in many of India's metropolitan areas, such as Bangalore, Madras, and Hyderabad. And salaries for IT professionals increased exponentially. Critical to the success of India's global IT business was the large pool of English-speaking professionals and skilled workers. This has contributed to an increasing middle class, growing to about 200 million. And you can see evidence of their success, sometimes through ostentatious consumption, imported cars, fancy homes, stylish Western clothes. The English language, then, is seen as the medium for this upwardly mobile class of Indians. Those who aspire to be part of this class must speak the language, the English language, the language of the elite.
I think there is a whole, an increasing elite which is much more at ease with English than it is with any Indian language.
For taking to a career, proper career, you need to understand English in many ways, at the university level, even at the school level. English happens to be more or less a need of the time because of technology, science. Unless you understand all this, you can't create a career for yourself, technology for that matter, where English becomes a necessity.
The language of corporations, of banks, of even the government, by and large, is English. English is the language that connects India with the rest of the world. So in a globalized world, that's really gives you a leg up to a much larger connect than a vernacular language would. It's simple as that.
As I said, the social mobility factor, even an ordinary person in a rural area today would like to show he knows English.
So even if somebody is staying in a village of say 1,000-odd population, even if that person is unable to speak English, unable to read English, what that person finds is on various channels, various private channels that are being on the television set, they find that these people also speak to a great extent in English, because they come from a particular class, because they have a peculiar lifestyle that this person has always dreamt of. And since English language is linked with that kind of lifestyle, it becomes an aspirational language for this rural person, you know. So even if he cannot speak English or read English, English becomes an aspiration for him more than anything else.
Therefore, you find this kind of a phenomenon even in a small little town where ordinary shopkeeper, driver would like to show that I know English. It may be not be the correct English, but they're able to communicate.
So for upwardly mobile Indians, English is the vehicle for their aspirations, the aspirational language. And in this environment, the English language newspaper has thrived.
And because the aspirational language is English, even though in percentage terms, the readership of English language newspapers is a fraction of the entire readership of the country, in terms of influence, in terms of aspirations, in terms of reach, I think the English language newspapers are still street ahead.
The English newspaper as a whole, if you see, has a penetration of about 1% of the total population. So what English papers are really doing in India is scratching the surface. There's a huge potential that they have. So while they're tapering off in the West, in Europe and America, it's a sunrise industry here. It's a huge future.
There's a whole new set of people who have now come up who know enough English to read an English language newspaper. About 15 or 20 years ago, I remember reading in the Cambridge Encyclopedia of the English Language, I think, where they calculated India's English-speaking population to be roughly 4% of the entire population. But they were in dominant positions, of course. Everybody in positions of power spoke English. Today, I think that figure is given as something between 6 and 7%. Some say 8, but it's probably closer to between 6 and 7. But remember, between 6 and 7 is 70 million people, which makes the English speaking, I mean, English writing is a different kind of, but English understanding, English speaking population as one of the largest in the world, actually right after the United States.
But unlike the United States and other developed countries in the West, in India, the survival of the newspaper itself is not in question. In fact, new editions are launched in city after city. For example, in Mumbai, India's largest city, formerly known as Bombay, these are the offices of a brand new newspaper, barely 6 months old. It's called DNA, which stands for Daily News and Analysis. And it's up against some formidable competition, the Times of India, a newspaper with a long and distinguished history.
Well, we are a new kid on the block, of course, and that means that we have to be both different and similar to the existing competition. The Times of India has been in this in this city for about 167 years. It's a paper that has enormous strength. It has a huge market share, and it has been till quite recently a monopoly. Now there are other newspapers in the city, us as well as the Hindustan Times, and our job is we are not trying for a niche audience or readership. We are going for what you might call a mass readership, like the Times. So we have to give more or less everything that the Times has, but we have to give something more.
But if they're going to give their readers more, it's important for DNA to know who their readers are. In the city of Pune, Ananda Gashe edits a Marathi language newspaper named Sakal, and he's keenly aware of the differences between his readership and that of the typical English language newspaper.
The socio-economic profile of the English language newspapers is such that they are read very widely by people who are in government, whether it's bureaucracy or other arms like judiciary, or they are also widely read by people who matter, in the sense that people from the industrial sector, people from the financial sector, these are the people who finally take the decisions that affect all the masses, the lives of masses. So obviously English language papers also have a very important role to play.
So while English is an aspirational language in India, as the journalists say, it's also a language of influence. And the English Language Daily has played a central role. But to understand the nature of that role, it's important to understand the particular cultural and political configuration of India. Regional governments are fairly autonomous from the central government in New Delhi, much like the federal and state divide in the United States. And that disconnect is accompanied by cultural and lifestyle differences in the same sense that West Texas differs from Michigan's Upper Peninsula or Southern California. But those regional differences are even greater in India because of differences in language. So the regional and national identities of an average Indian exist as parallels. In this scenario, language or vernacular newspapers, the Marathi, Gujarati, Bengali, and other papers, they're important for the regional audiences. That's where issues of regional importance get covered. On the other hand, the English newspapers are the national media, meaning issues of national importance get voiced in the English language. Kumar Ketkar edits the Marathi language newspaper Loksata in Mumbai. And he sees that the language divide sometimes even divides people from their own past.
Even if a profound article appears in Lok Satta, it will limit its readership to Marathi speaking people, and among them only those who are going through Marathi medium. Those who have already migrated and passed from the colleges in English medium, they are not going to read Lok Satta or Maharashtra Times or Lokmat. They are going to read Times of India, Midday or what have you, or DNA or Hindustan Times Today. So as a result, they are cut off from their own intellectual community. So even if there is a profound article, a new point of view or a new policy alternative is suggested in Lok Satta, it will limit itself to geographical area and a linguistic area. Whereas in English, it will automatically cut across boundaries. So naturally, the national dialogue does not take place in any Indian language. National dialogue for policy always takes in English. And therefore, if I have to make a point across the country, I have to write in my sister publication Indian Express, who actually own Lok Satta. So this is this dichotomy of sort, and that is important to understand in terms of media influence. Therefore, at local politics, it is Lok Satta that will dominate.
This English language domination of the national debate was not always the case. In fact, the late Prime Minister Indira Gandhi once dismissed English media as unimportant.
Mrs. Gandhi, about 30 years ago, used to say, you people account for 0.0005%. That means the English newspaper did not matter at all. Because she said, your ears are not to the ground. But that has totally changed in the last 15 years.
You've got to make a differentiation between newspapers which make an impact in Delhi and newspapers which make an impact on politics or society at the state levels and the local levels. I would say, for example, that most government decisions here in Delhi at the center are based on what appears in the English language newspapers. The language of decision making in government here in Delhi is English. Secondly, in other areas of government such as the armed forces, there again the language is in English, and therefore the references in those discussions are also to the English language press and not to the ones in Indian language newspapers. Thirdly, in corporate rooms, again decisions are based on what appears in English papers and not on what appears in the Indian language papers.
The influence of English press on the policymakers or on the judiciary or on the bureaucracy or on the banking or finance industry or on the stock market or on the intellectual debate is highest, because English becomes a national lingua franca. Whatever appears in the Hindu edition of Delhi is also being read by the Hindu edition in Madras, Chennai. Whatever appears in the Times of India Delhi edition, Mumbai edition reads, Calcutta edition reads, because they have this multi-edition. So they kind of unite a certain class of India.
And yet, while the language newspapers do not play a very important role in the national debate, they essentially determine who's taking part in that debate. It points up a curious aspect of Indian political life. Unlike the United States, those most likely to vote in Indian local elections are the lower socio-economic classes. The so-called elites, or upper classes, tend not to take part in the electoral process.
Because the English reading public does not form an electorate. English reading public is generally indifferent to electoral process. They are unconcerned about democratic values or democratic aspirations. They are the elite. They have their cake and they can eat it irrespective of which party is in power. That is why English language press feels that they call the shots, while actually they don't. They call the shots after the government is in power and IAS officers are established. Then they determine the policy options. But who puts them in power? It is the language people, not the language press, but the language people who are rooted in that language, who get influenced by the local language press. So this is a kind of paradox and dichotomous relationship inside the media.
The role of the English language daily intersects yet another deep divide in India's social landscape, the economic divide. While India is a fast-growing economic power, there are still around 400 million Indians who have not been able to partake of the new prosperity founded on the globalized economy. And changing their economic stature within their lifetime seems an impossible dream. These are the rural poor, farmers who own very little or no land and work for a subsistence wage. Many farmers in the so-called prosperous states, such as Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh, have committed suicide because conditions are desperate. Tribal communities are displaced and further impoverished because of modernization projects that claim forests and rivers, the main resources for these communities. Then there are the millions of the rural poor who have migrated to the city in search of work and live in appalling urban slums and shanty towns. Is their reality reflected in the national media mirror? Do the English papers speak to the issues of the other India?
Barring a notable few, I would say. Maybe a couple of English newspapers do that. I think the language press in India is much more reflective of what's happening.
Sankarsham Thakur is the editor of the English language weekly paper Tehelka, and he has little patience for most of the other English publications.
The English newspaper is floats with its feet up in the air. It's a metro paper. Metros don't belong to anyone. Everybody in a metro is a sort of refugee from somewhere else looking for a job or a career. So our metros are not really rooted places for anyone other than the business salaried classes. So I think the language press cannot escape reporting what's happening in its area of circulation.
I think a lot of what the language journalists do is far better than what the English journalists do. They're far more rooted, they're far more grounded, and they cater to a readership that is far, far more engaged and argumentative.
Tarun Tejpal is executive editor of Tehelka. He's trying to push his paper against the grain, to do the kind of investigative journalism in India that's not usually associated with English newspapers.
The English reader is actually a fairly effete, fattened reader. I mean, he just reads the kind of glamour stuff and a little bit of the sort of politics and the crime and so on. He's not an engaged reader. My turn on, I'm an English language journalist. My working language is English. My thinking language is English. But my greatest turn on for Tehelka is to see it go into Hindi, because that's the reader I want to access, because that's the reader I know who will respond to the kind of journalism we are doing. And the rationale for that is not too far to find, because it's that reader represents a constituency that is struggling for change, that is struggling for development, that's struggling to make new things out of the old world. And that's the kind of constituency that needs information, that needs opinions, that needs analysis, that needs to range itself against these things. The elite of Delhi and Bombay and Bangalore are doing very well for themselves. Yeah? I mean, they have the cream of this country to feed off. Yeah? They're okay. I mean, they really don't need. I mean, they don't want to be disturbed with too many issues that might give them a few sleepless hours. And so, in many ways, they are not the ideal audience for great journalism. The ideal audience for great journalism exists in the languages, and let me tell you, the language papers are thriving, they are booming, I mean, they're selling hugely. In Tehelka itself, over the last 2 years, I have consistently hired people from non-English journalism, from Hindi journalism. Even today, I tell my editors, just be very, very open to taking in reporters from non-English journalism, because the language with the reporter doesn't matter. It's the ability, the courage, the resourcefulness, the ability to get a story. So we are very open, and we have actually taken in the last 2 years very many journalists who don't come from English journalism but come from Hindi journalism.
Vijay Tendulkar is a former journalist and one of India's most respected playwrights. He sees the English newspapers as elitist, far removed from realities of much of the country, and catering to a readership that does not relate to the problems of iniquities and poverty in India.
As I see it, because you really don't know the ground reality. You are not aware of what's happening in the country. You are aware only of what is happening in the 4 major cities, and that to a particular elite class who is making strides towards some kind of prosperity. But they don't represent the real India at all. And in English media, in fact, you find this gap, wide gap. You come across any number of claims of India becoming the world power. But India's poverty, for that matter, the increasing unemployment, increasing rate of crime, that is not represented in the real sense.
Education is one thing, public health is another thing, lack of adequate electricity is another thing, lack of transport facilities for farm produce is another big issue in most parts of the country. This is something that you will never find being reflected in the mainline English papers. On the other hand, you will find that newspaper columns of regional language papers are filled to a great extent with issues of this kind.
If you don't cover village India, then I think you have a problem.
N. Ram is editor and publisher of one of India's largest English language dailies, The Hindu. It's known for its coverage of social issues in rural India. As a way of acknowledging its importance, he has placed well-known reporter and commentator P. Sainath in charge.
Sainath is now a rural affairs editor and spends a lot of time, probably unique in the English language press, for coverage of rural India and deprivation in particular, problems including farmer suicides, starvation, deaths, problems, and as well as positive stories from rural India. So really reporting from a theatre which is very poorly covered by the English language press. So we consciously sought to respond to that deficit by really putting it at the center of our agenda, of journalistic, the agenda.
But the idea of a rural India mired in poverty contrasted with an economically booming urban India is disappearing. Today, the countryside is becoming more urbanized, while at the same time, the cities are feeling the effects of rural immigration.
Rural areas are not going to remain the same rural areas that they were 20 or 50 years ago. What we used to call villages, and the old cliche that, oh, India lives in its villages, it's simply not true anymore. What we used to call villages are small towns now, or some are middle-sized towns. And they get television, they buy white goods, they buy motorcycles and scooters, they buy cars. It's changing rapidly because much of modernization, for better or for worse, is a process of urbanization. And one of the biggest problems we have in a city like Bombay, for instance, is that the urbanization process is in fact a bit of it's a paradox, but it's a bit of a ruralization process because there are lots of people coming in to the city in search of employment and they're unable to find housing because of the extraordinary high cost of land. And they form most of the homeless that you find on the streets of Bombay. And their habits are not urban habits. It will take some time. But people say, oh, how can so many millions be allowed to live on the streets? And isn't it terrible? It is. Hygienically, visually, everything is terrible about it, morally terrible. But if you look at it in purely economic terms, these people are clearly better off than they were where they came from. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here. They'll go back.
It's this reality of the city that the English newspaper seems to have ignored as it cultivates an upwardly mobile professional readership. This is a shift from the historic role of the English language daily played in colonial and later independent India. Following independence in 1947, the print press was the only free mass medium in India. Radio and later television were government-owned and controlled. But in the 1990s, satellite TV beamed in programming from Hong Kong, and the Indian government had to give up total control of television. Doordarshan, the remaining government-controlled TV station, was forced to compete with commercial television for viewers. Not only did TV open up the media market, it coveted the multinational ads for consumer goods that were flooding Indian markets. And as the advertising pie expanded, so did the competition for a slice of that pie. Newspapers, too, were forced to compete with commercial TV.
Nearly 60-65% of the revenue comes from advertisements. And thanks to the proliferation of private news television channels over the last 10-15 years, a major chunk of advertisements has started going from print to audiovisual. So the cake has shrunk, basically. That's one thing. The number of newspapers has increased. So the number of competitors has increased. So there is added pressure now on all newspaper establishments, all newspaper managements to somehow manage the economics of the paper.
And managing the economics means remaining profitable while maintaining a journalistic mission of public service. It's a balancing act that's certainly not unique to India, and it affects both English language and regional language newspapers in the same way.
The commercial is just part of that construct, I mean, there is nothing innately pernicious about a commercial impulse. I mean, you can't have this paper unless you can make the bottom line work. I mean, that in fact becomes the greatest challenge of all. How do you make the bottom line work?
Yet, English language papers have recently been criticized for becoming too zealously commercial. And the Times of India in particular is singled out for abdicating its responsibilities.
It is Times proprietor who, I should say, de-intellectualized and tried to cater to the readers only of the upper class.
it is 3 types of material that the editor has to give to readers. He has to educate, he has to inform, educate and entertain. Now, what the Times proprietors did was the first 2, that is one, what the readers want to read. Second is what the advertisers want readers to read. Because of the new economic angle, they had to include that in it. And the third aspect, what the editor wants readers to read, to educate that part, that was totally forgotten. And then we have page 3 culture.
So-called page 3 culture is the term for press coverage of social events of the elites, complete with pictures and gossip.
You must have heard about all these page 3 personalities, you know. So there is a particular social circle where all the elite of the society, they mingle with each other, they party together, and all those kinds of things.
And page 3 culture represents a particular class of reader that the English language newspaper values.
English press is happy with this audience, so it is not necessary to look at the rest 700 million people. You can make your profit by selling the space of these advertisers and these corporates to this class, which is more than enough to make money, and they are making huge money.
And what about the public interest principle and the newspaper's role in shaping public opinion? The Times resident editor dismisses the idea.
I think it's a pompous assumption that English newspapers shape opinions, national opinions. Coming back to what I said, it's 1% of the population. And there's been an explosion in the media. There's television, there is radio, there's a net, vernacular dailies. I think, reader, people are consuming information from many sources. And the most direct impact to my mind is television.
And Dilip Padgaonkar adds that the idea of public interest needs to be updated in a highly competitive, technologically evolving world.
The minute you mention public interest, then you vest the editor of the paper with that degree of omniscience, which he or she doesn't deserve. So we'll have to, we still are in the mode of, what should then be the responsibility of the editor? What should be the overall responsibility of the newspaper? And to which the answer is that rather than speak in very abstract terms about public interest, one would say, look, this is my kind of readership. These are the social and economic and cultural traits of this readership, and my job is to cater to these people.
But Tarun Tejpal of Tehelka bristles at the idea of public interest as an abstract term.
That's a bit of a washout. I think it's a bit of like throwing in the towel. Is the notion too abstract? The notion of a nation is abstract. The notion of honor is abstract. The notion of love is abstract. I mean, these are all abstract notions. How is public interest less or more abstract than the notion of love? Does it mean love doesn't exist? Nobody should be following, listening, or reading about love? That's just absurd. I mean, public interest is a very clear, actually almost tangible construct. I mean, when you see a story, even a fool can tell whether this story is in the public interest or not. Is this voyeuristic, titillatory, commercially biased, politically biased, or is it in public interest? Get me to 100 stories, I can give you a reading on all 100 stories whether they are not, yes or no, yes or no. I don't think it's an abstraction. I think there's a kind of softness to Indian journalism and media that has crept in, and it's again possibly a global phenomenon. I think there's a kind of throwing in of the towel, and I have a problem with that. I think there are battles that need to be waged. They needn't necessarily be won. And I think if journalists and editors develop the notion that the battle is no longer worth waging, I think then we are in trouble. I think the central notion in any democracy which journalism needs to hang by is the idea of public interest. And I think that diluted itself. The notion that at the heart of all good and great journalism is the idea of public interest. That's the defining principle.
But while editors may disagree on the concept of public interest, they generally agree that English language newspapers in India do indeed reflect a changing social reality.
The entire media industry in India is undergoing such dramatic changes, and unless you understand in which way India itself is undergoing change, you probably can't understand or come to grips with the changes taking place in the media.
And among the greatest transformations has to do with Indians' relationship to government and the marketplace.
The first such trend is that the state as the sole repository of power and authority, that importance is shifting away from the state to the economy.
The general approach has been to move away from state-dominated news or government and political news. Well, government news is still there, but political news that is Delhi generated, or to more lifestyle stories, trend stories, economic and corporate stories, technology stories. If you look at the old Times of India or the Statesman, or even the Hindu for that matter, it's mostly court news and bureaucratic news and what Prime Minister said somewhere. And if the Prime Minister said she's fighting poverty, so it made big news.
To that extent, I think the Times of India has reacted to the larger societal change and reoriented its approach from entirely through the prism of the state to a much more people-oriented approach.
There have been two other changes, one not yet very perceptible, but I do think that the balance is shifting from a male-dominated society to not a female-dominated one, but where women are beginning to assert their rights and to gain it. And that is something that is obvious to me at various levels whenever I travel in this country.
Position of women, position of lower castes, position of small towns, attitudes towards dress codes, attitudes towards music, attitudes towards the rest of the world. Everything is in a flux right now. And it's, I think, our job as a newspaper, especially a new newspaper, to try to track those changes.
But perhaps the most important change, which the outside world has yet to come to grips with, is that India is an astonishingly young nation. More than 70% of its population is less than 35 years old. What it means is that unlike many countries in the West, or countries such as Japan, unlike these countries, for at least another 35 years, India's workforce will keep on expanding. And what this means in terms of, growth rates and development and so on and so forth, that's something that needs to be understood. It is an astonishingly young nation.
There's a whole bunch of young people who are coming up, especially in metropolitan and urban areas, who do not read newspapers, or did not read newspapers at least, as much as their parents did. They tend to get the information either from television or from the net. How can a newspaper appeal to that audience?
And this is some of the audience he's talking about. University students in Mumbai who confirm that they're not only plugged into the latest electronic media, but also the earliest.
I use the internet. And there are various websites, where you can access, you can read the news on the website.
I'd say I use the internet quite a bit, mainly for overseas news and for sports-related news. And the radio is not used much, and I guess the TV as well. Like you have these news channels.
Sorry, the radio is used so much.
I know the radio is used.
The radio is used so much. It's unbelievable.
Not for news.
Of course, for news. There are so many. You now not only have talk shows on the radio, like just general talk shows about friendship and college and all that nonsense, but you also have talk shows, where they're restricted to sport, or they're restricted to some particular field, or there's a show where every day they have somebody new coming on to discuss something in particular, which can be news related. It doesn't have to be about a new song that's happening or a new album that's out. But you do have they are coming out with things. Sports,
in the country, the radio has the widest reach.
Yeah.
The radio has the widest reach.
If you were to compare it to something like the US, where everybody has the radio switched on at some point in the day, in that sense, like in a city in India, no one really listens to the radio.
Yeah, but you're looking at the city in India. You're looking at the city in India. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, but the radio does have the widest reach. So, and there is news on the radio. I used to hear it all the time when I was back home, but it is there. I don't listen to the news on the radio, but it is there. If we're giving a sense of rural India, like I said, the radio has a wider reach, because there are lots of places where you don't have television, and very remote places in India where the internet is not even heard of. So the radio does have a wide reach. Television, if it is there, you get the news. So mainly these two.
I'd say the most important.
But while educated young people in India are increasingly techno-savvy, they nonetheless represent the future readership for India's expanding newspaper circulation.
Newspapers are expanding, and even English language newspapers, of course, the vernacular language newspapers, Hindi newspapers are expanding even more rapidly. But English language newspapers in cities like Mumbai and Delhi, and even in Chennai or Bangalore, have growing circulations. A lot of that is being bought by young people who have just come into the professions, who are taking their own decisions, deciding what to do with their lives. And we are just hoping that newspapers still provide them with a perspective that they cannot get, let's say, from television.
So I think that has been one of these great dramatic things that are happening. There's also been a shift, noticeable one, from the upper castes to the middle castes and the ones below them. And that shift has taken place largely on account of democracy.
And emblematic of that shift is Lalu Prasad Yadav, a well-known railway minister whose elevation from a lower social caste to a position of power in government is among the most dramatic examples.
It's democratic forces which have enabled these social groups who were otherwise marginalized or oppressed to now claim a stake in the power structure. And they've been doing it rather successfully. So that's again a change that's been happening.
But changes in governmental power have been more than matched by changes in the Indian marketplace.
For the first time, I think, in living memory, and I do not exaggerate, Indians are neither ashamed to make money or to spend it. And this is a big sea change, because for nearly 4.5 decades after independence, we had this whole business of socialism, the license permit Raj, etc. And you've had that change coming in. Yet another change flowing from this one is how much education now matters, not just to climb up the social ladder, but to become economically better off.
These changes in Indian society are reflected in changes in the direction and objectives of newspapers. During the British colonial period, the major newspapers were British-owned and stood for the maintenance of the empire. But there were also newspapers owned by wealthy Indians, and they called for an end to British rule.
So there were always two kinds of English newspapers, even in British India. One was defending the state and the empire, and the other was more nationalistic. This changed from the 1950s after India's independence in 1947, and the nationalist newspapers had mostly outlived their purpose with independence coming.
But over the decades, India's press matured into a new role as crusader, investigator, and social watchdog.
Journalists took up positions, they fought vested interests, they took on politicians, they took on business houses, and they stood up and were counted. In the 1990s, we had an incredible wash of trivia, color pages, satellite television, and a lot of the core mandate of journalism, particularly in a democracy like India, it got diluted.
So we have to tell the rising sections of the population what they want.
But clearly, I mean, the idea of media as a strong commercial vehicle has grown across the world, and concomitant to such an idea is the idea of the reader as a consumer. What does the consumer want? It's not about what we should give the consumer. It's about what does the consumer really want.
And in catering to consumer desires, newspapers have increasingly borrowed from the aims and terminology of marketing.
About 25 years ago, newspaper for the first time was being termed as a brand. And today almost everyone has accepted that newspaper also is a brand, is a product like any other product in the market. That wasn't the case earlier. In the pre-independence period, of course, it was not considered to be a kind of a product, because it was considered to be a vehicle to fight against the alien British rule. So there the profit and loss was not material at all.
Now, with the increased importance of the marketplace and dependence on advertising for their existence, newspapers are picking their editorial targets more carefully.
You will see very few actually exposes or investigations against business houses. Politics, yes, they're seen as easy game. But even politicians, there's a hierarchy to politicians. You'll very seldom see a big-time politician, you know, nailed. Most often, what Indian media chooses to do is to actually, a phrase I've used in the past, is to sort of, you know, run with the wolves and hunt the rabbits. So you go for the soft targets. You go for targets who won't hit back. So you retain an investigative veneer by actually exposing people who are soft targets, who can't hit back. And that's a failing. I mean, that's a real failing. But the failing, as I said, there's a commercial rationale to it.
And what constrains independence or erodes it or threatens it would be largely, I think, if I were to generalize, market pressures in India.
When I sell my paper at 10 rupees, I mean, I lose 3 rupees a copy. The more I sell, the more I lose. Unless I bring in advertising, I can't. But if I'm going and hitting the same guys who are going to give me advertising, I'm not going to get any advertising. I'll just shut down.
And the reluctance of the English language press to challenge power is accompanied by a reluctance to challenge the reader with complicated stories.
The so-called dumbing down of the media is so rapid now that I don't think Times of India or Hindustan Times or DNA take as much interest as they should, even in the urban areas they live, because they are so entertainment centric, fashion and celebrity centric, and consumer centric and shopping mall centric, Hollywood centric, that they consider the problem of Amitabh Bachchan's health as more important than 60% of Mumbai, which lives in pathetic health conditions.
There's a clear tendency to tabloidize or dumb down or to sensationalize. You will see that tendency, bad puns, trying to be very young and loud, the well-known definition of tabloidization is you highlight celebrities and the personal. It seems to be a generational thing, and I think you need to appeal to young people also.
Yet it seems that at least some young people have also noticed this so-called dumbing down process and are not necessarily buying into it.
Yeah, so I feel basically there's a big dumbing down of the media here. People go for glossiness. That's what sells. I guess it's similar to the American media in many ways, in the sense that you have big conglomerates who control it.
Newspapers today are so much more about entertainment than they are about providing information.
But despite constraints, commercial, political, or social, India's newspapers are free, and a free press is a pillar of India's democracy.
But in practice, compared with most developing countries, I think India is in an enviable situation. Journalists in India are in an enviable situation. I mean, they may occasionally face intimidation from extremist groups, sometimes from governments, but I won't complain too much.
Election after election has shown that India's poor, marginalized, and disempowered do participate in democracy. It's these multitudes more than the city's elites that go to the polling booths. And while India's English language papers may not cater to or represent their needs and realities, the existing abundance of language papers do provide a voice to these many diverse groups, a sign of India's healthy democracy.
I mean, when you look at democracies, what are the three interest structures in any democracy? There's business, there's politics, and there's media. Any democracy. Politics and business would always work hand in hand because they serve each other. The only joker in the pack is media. But if you co-opt media also, you have a closed system. You don't have a democracy. I mean, you have a closed system. It's just a closed system of patronage, And that's what worries me, that media can also become so easily co-opted. But what worries me still more is that the media is so willing to become co-opted. I mean, business and politics will always try and co-opt media. It suits them to co-opt media. But should the media be working towards its own co-option? I think that's what's worrying. And the fact is, a lot of media is.
But in the end, he finds two hopeful signs. One is the rapidly growing rate of literacy and education, assuring and expanding readership. The other is that Indian newspapers remain largely independent, not owned by huge multinational corporations, as is the case in much of the West.
You know, here, how can anybody clamp down on media? I mean, how many editors and owners will you kind of get on your side and clamp down on? 50, 100, 500? Not possible. That's the strength of Indian media. Just so much of it, you know, and so fragmented. And I, for one, I hope it stays that way always. Fragmented, multifarious, plural, chaotic. It's the one way which is a great prophylactic against any fascism.